Welcome back to the Damn Parenting Podcast. My name's Eva and I'm glad you're here with me. Now, I'm not even going to go off script here. I tried to write something out, but the reality is it's Friday night. My brain is fried. And instead of even trying to force something proper, I just really want to make sure you guys got something meaningful to listen to this weekend. Because if you listen to Wednesday's episode about the identity shift in motherhood with Dr. Naomi Gibson, you might have noticed something interesting. Well, at least I noticed something interesting because a lot of you listened. And that tells me that the topic is landing. And the thing about episodes like it, even though it's recorded over 2 years ago, is that they can land differently depending on where you are right now. If it's the newborn survival mode, the 4th month sleep regression, being at home all day with a baby who doesn't even interact yet, the loneliness, maybe they started daycare, you're back to work, or they even started school. Wherever you are, if Wednesday's episode resonated with you and you found yourself wanting to understand a little bit more about what's happening, then this episode is going to be for you. Because today, you're going to hear the conversation we had with the wonderful Ilena Standring. Now, Ilena is not just a doula here in Amsterdam who welcomes babies earthside, she also welcomes mothers into motherhood because she does this with a beautiful mix of honesty about the hard parts and a deep belief in how powerful and transformative this period of life can be. So Wednesday's episode was Dr. Naomi speaking about the identity shift. Last year, I had Dr. Elke de Witte on the podcast talking about her book, The Mother Brain Myth, which is only available in Dutch, but I insisted we talk about it in English as well, because mother's health or women's health knowledge just should never be gatekept. And today with Ilena, we go deeper into the values and transformation behind Matrescence. We know the word now, so let's explore what it really means. And I do want to say, Ilena has this amazing explanation, a gathering of words. So I'm going to give it to you briefly here. But Ilena describes Matrescence as the period of adaptation into motherhood, a process that touches more than 30 aspects of life: physical, psychological, emotional, neurobiological, hormonal, spiritual, relational, societal, and, well, honestly, that list keeps going on, which might actually be one of the most accurate descriptions of motherhood ever given. So wherever you are this weekend, maybe you're out taking a walk in the sunshine, or maybe you're folding laundry for the 5th time. I hope this episode gives you a moment to pause and reflect, because it might just give you the language to parts of your experience you've always really felt, but you just never had those words for. And if you've heard this conversation before, I'd genuinely love to know, does it land differently for you now? Because these conversations, they're not just for us. They are for our sisters, our daughters, our partners, and hopefully, eventually, society at large. Because once motherhood is truly acknowledged for what it is, a profound human transformation, maybe then we start to see the support mothers actually deserve. All right, that wasn't so bad. I don't know if you heard my cat meowing there, but let's get into this conversation with Ilena Standring. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Damn Parenting, your English-speaking parenting podcast. We are your hosts, Maren and
Eva.
And we are so delighted to have Ilena back today with us. Hi, Ilena.
Hello.
And when Elena's on, it's going to be an amazing episode. Grab your tissues, get ready to take off into an emotional roller coaster of all the good things that Ilena is going to talk about today. And we want to follow up on last week's episode with Naomi, where we talked about identity shift in motherhood. And there was a term that came up during this talk with Naomi, and that was the matrescence. So we thought, let's bring an expert on who really delved into this topic. And Ilena, did that. And her topic is matrescence. She loves to talk about it and educate people. So we thought, let's sit down with her and tackle this. We wanted to give you a brief overview of what is matrescence. Why is it so important to talk about this term in the context of motherhood? So if you have never heard of this term before, then first of all, you have not listened to last week's episode. But secondly, Ilena, can you give us a brief overview? What does matrescence mean?
Yeah. So if you look matrescence up in the dictionary, then the dictionary definition is going to sound something as neat and concise as this. So it's going to say the process of becoming a mother. And then it's going to give a quote to give it context, which would be something along the lines of, those physical, psychological, and emotional changes you go through after the birth of your child now have a name: matrescence, the process of becoming a mother, which anthropologists call matrescence has been largely unexplored in the medical community. Largely unexplored, I would almost say completely unexplored and completely ignored, even though this was coined by Dana Raphael in 1973. If you do like a Google search for matrescence, then one of the top hits will be a really wonderful TED Talk by Dr. Alexandra Sachs, who did a talk called Birth of a Mother in 2017. And she went on to write a couple of books, one of which is How Come No One Told Me? And that's very much all about matrescence. It's a great talk. It's like 9 minutes, so it's something to enjoy with a sandwich. And I definitely really encourage people to look at that TED Talk. She did a couple of pieces of writing about matrescence also in the New York Times. So they'll also come up if you Google her name. We're going to link everything up anyway afterwards. So that's awesome. I hosted for the first time in a group setting, like mini workshop about matrescence. And I decided after like my research and all the years that I've been working with mothers to define matrescence as something more closely aligned with this sentence. It's a long sentence. The period of adaptation to and evolution through the rite of passage, the new life phase that is motherhood, a period and process which encompasses the physical, psychological, emotional, neurobiological, genetic, hormonal, spiritual, sexual, political, professional, cosmic, ancestral, societal, relational, and brain blitzing inner and outer metamorphosis, which all occurs simultaneously to the all-consuming and sometimes thwarting process of keeping a tiny human/tiny humans alive and functioning.
So this is your fancy definition of what is a shit show?
Exactly.
Now we all can fancy it up with this is actually what's happening. But yeah, this is very much in you. I think you have really, like, with your sentence, touched upon all the areas that we are affected by when becoming a mother. And this is also when you said political, that rang up the bell when Naomi talked about how it radicalized her being a mother. And all of a sudden you pay attention to all the things that are not right.
Yeah. And, there's a lot of, in your fantastic discussion with Naomi that I listened to this morning twice, you also talked about mom rage and the hormonal side. The reality is I always say matrescence is a process that's a 12 to 14 year process by definition. And I would even venture that actually experientially, I have some friends who are like in their early 50s and they're like going through menopause and their children are like in their teenage years. They don't feel like they've stepped out of the process of matrescence, not by any stretch. Like they still feel knee deep in it. But, imagine all of the hormonal changes that happen throughout those like 12 to 14 years. And that rage that we get, when we're like picking up the toys again and we're in that Groundhog Day, that applies politically too. Like when you're in that process where you're opening yet another creche bill and you're thinking, how absolutely impossibly ironic is it that the government is happy to pay me to pay somebody else to take care of my child, but will not make any contribution to me raising my child and developing, deepening, strengthening the attachment and the connection that I have with my own child. If you look at this from a shadow perspective, the radicalization can even go to that suspicious place that's like, that would be a remarkably convenient way to control people, wouldn't it? To make sure that they don't have very strong attachments and to make sure that they're timetabled up to their eyeballs by the time they're one and that they're used to having their needs met by people that change every day. That would be a really wonderful way to keep people malleable and easy to manipulate.
And keep women exhausted. Like,
yeah, literally. And that is one thing that I do want to say before we really dive into this. I am aware that sometimes I can be like super idealistic. Like I have an Aquarius sun, so I often like zoom out and look at things from a very cosmic lens. But that kind of idealistic lens can also sometimes come across as being very, very privileged. And the reality is that unfortunately, it can be a bit of a question of privilege to have the time and space and bandwidth to really like dive into these topics and, explore them leisurely. The reality is most of us don't have time for like a 10-day retreat to explore matrescence. So I hope that today we can really like cultivate this curiosity and begin to open people's eyes to the richness of this life phase and give different ideas about how it can be explored like in an emotional amongst, like when you've got that 20 minutes just before bed, when hopefully lots of little eyelids are closed and you have the quiet to just dive in and feel something through.
Can you actually give us a comparison of Matrescence to the other like life transitions you spoke there about, your friends in menopause or the adolescence?
As Naomi said last week, you know, the reality is that the definition came about because Dana Raphael and her team of anthropologists looked at the reality of the physical, the biological, the hormonal shifts that are happening to a mother in this kind of period of time that you're becoming a mother. And matrescence is as hormonally ravaging for the body as adolescence is. And sometimes then you do really need to just kind of, you know, if you're listening to this and you do have a kid in the teenage years and you're dealing with the like new man sweat or the stinky trainers that you don't want to bring inside, you know, you've got a really tangible example of what that's like. But, you know, that, for example, nobody told me how my sweat was going to smell. I don't even know as I started
I remember
breastfeeding.
this. I was like, who am I? What is this? What? I remember. Yes. And I thought about this when we talked with Naomi about adolescence becoming being a teenager. I was like, oh yeah, the stank's back.
I remember going to Holland and Barrett trying to get some, like, you know, because part of my matrescence was like, I became Earth Mother. Like I went from this person who used to like have 4 different Lenore fabric softeners to no fabric softener, vinegar and bicarb all the way. And so like I wasn't using my Kerastase hair products anymore at that point either. So I went to Holland and Barrett. I was like, I really need like a natural sulfate-free shampoo because I have hair that is greasier than it ever was when I was a teenager. And they were like, well, what's happening with you? Are you washing it enough? I was like, friend.
Wow.
Like washing it every day, washing it once a week. So those are the things that are happening, as well as that, you know, that deep insecurity that comes along with those hormonal shifts of, whoa, I suddenly am reacting to this. You know, I used to work as, it sounds probably impossible to imagine, but I used to work as a headhunter in banking and financial services, in risk management. I was like the only woman for 5 kilometers. And so I always used to prize myself on my poker face. But I went from that, and then in the course of like, you know, 9 months, if I heard a baby crying in the supermarket, yes, my eyes would be pricking and tears would be just pooling in my eyes. But my nipples were like leaking tears too. I know that we sometimes talk about that. And I, you know, did really like in your conversation that you spoke of, that Naomi really identified also this like weird polarization that happens on social media, that there's this kind of like hustle, influence, sell, celebrate, joy, unicorn diarrhea, glittery, everything, or this is hell. And the reality is, most of us are oscillating between those two states, and this weird kind of, sometimes, you know, Eva, you spoke really nicely to this kind of thing that can happen when suddenly your baby has a need and you're like, whoa, I've got to serve and function this need right now. So you just disappear into the background. You know, one of the things I always say is, I feel like I gave birth to my son and I gave birth to an entirely new landscape within my heart space that was so far beyond anything I ever considered myself to be capable of. So it's like this new life is bursting forth. And, you know, another thing that you talked about with Naomi, and also that I was tagged in 2 different posts yesterday from people who were talking about like these life phases. You know, one of them was actually about perimenopause that I was tagged in because it was more of a personal tag. And then one of them was about motherhood and matrescence. And both of them were speaking about this concept that you give birth to a new version of you. And actually, that isn't how I see it. And that's not necessarily what I would want to necessarily perpetuate. I see it more as an unraveling of all the different things that we take on as labels and as statuses and symbols and signs of statuses or roles that we play. And it's a shedding of the things that actually really don't align with who we are. And it's a condensing and a coming closer to the essence of who you are. And if you look at this also like archetypally, and that, I think the archetypal lens is a really wonderful way to look at these life phases too, because you've got the archetypal phase of maidenhood, the spring of our lives as women, motherhood, the summer of our lives as women, Marga, the autumn of our lives as women, and Crone, the winter of our lives as women. And, if you look at it through that archetypal lens and you apply that lens of kind of those seasons, then it isn't a rebirth at all. It is an unraveling. It is a shedding. And it is coming closer to that continual evolution and unfolding of who you are. And I have to recognize that sometimes that feels way too deep for some people. So I also accept that notion of, I didn't just give birth to a baby, I gave birth to a new version of me. I can accept that probably feels more digestible for people, but I do secretly want to encourage people to go deeper. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is exactly what you say. Everyone always talks about it's a new version because people can resonate with that because it's a new thing that they don't know anything about. But equally, it also takes time for people to then understand, well, what is this new version? Is it 2.0 or is it 1.1? And, there's different levels of whatever that may be. As we're all in Amsterdam here, and as there's like plateau of like so many different cultures here, can you speak on behalf of how the different cultures and societies actually view this period in a woman's life?
Yeah, gosh, sometimes I think I'd like to go back to university and study anthropology in order to like get a PhD in matrescence. Like literally, I mean that with my whole being. Culturally, we can look at it. And, we can't look at the different cultural perspectives without also looking in a wider angle lens, also at, different religious ways to mark this, different like rites of passage that mark this. If you look at the Jewish culture, for example, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the Jewish culture, Judaism, has a tradition of women taking what's called a mikveh before really big rites of passage, like marriage, like birth. And, we in modern day life, I guess the equivalent might be like a baby shower, but it's quite rare to go to a baby shower that really embraces the essence of what is actually happening at a baby shower. I know there are some doulas who make amazing contributions to baby showers and do really wonderful rituals with like red threads, that everybody's there, gets a bracelet of a red thread that they're holding and they're wearing until the baby is born. In more ancient situations, you would way before motherhood, the red tent is a really good example of how these rites of passage were celebrated. Women came together, sat in a literal red tent for periods of life where they were at the very end of pregnancy waiting to have a baby. First of all, they arrived in that tent with the arrival of their first menstruation. And then they're going in there with their hot flushers and they're being held by other women in order to not necessarily educate them in the way that we now in our modern life view education, but to witness them in that life phase and to give that multifaceted space holding of practical, emotional, spiritual witnessing that is that holding space. Does that make sense?
Wondering also the whole thing of that was that you're not alone. Like every episode that we preach, you're not alone, you're not alone. There, you really felt I am not alone because I am surrounded by women who have walked this path or who will watch me walk this path. So they are somewhat prepared. But nevertheless, in whatever state you're in, you don't have to walk alone.
Exactly.
There's an actual place. Yeah. Do you think how big a tent do we need to set up in Oyster Park to make this happen?
Oh my God, how amazing would that be?
I love,
just
by
the bandstand.
We are just on video, but Ilena is wearing a bright red scarf. So we are in our tent right now here on Zoom. going through the matrescence process.
Something that really stayed with me, it made me laugh. And then I also really just literally touched my heart as I was cycling along, listening to your conversation with Naomi. You know, you talked about this phrase that was shared with you, dancing with dragons, right? And, you know, the reality of that, like I am absolutely stand with you and stand by you with what you just said. Like, literally, you already have all the answers within you for sure. Sometimes you're not going to like the answer.
Yes.
So sometimes it's really going to be, you know, if we think back to the kind of that idea of radicalization and that political change, it might be that your whole life until you became a mother, that you've grown up with like a super strong working mother. Maybe she was a CEO and you were like, okay, of course I'm going to be a working mother. And then your baby arrives and something is almost telling you on a physical level, I cannot leave her. I must stay here. I feel this biological imperative to stay by her side. I cannot psychologically, spiritually, politically, physically bring myself to go back to my work. It just doesn't feel right. And that dissonance that is created, that again speaks then to this process that I think is actually what's happening, this unraveling of the conditioning, letting go of some layers to come back to that essence of what's truly important and what's truly aligned with how I want to experience this period myself and how I want my child to experience this. And of course, how I want our family history to be written. And, you know, that can be super confronting internally, but also with a partner. You know, if you met a partner and you dated through your 20s and maybe you were the party power people who, you know, were always known for hosting these crazy, excessive, wonderful parties because you were just rolling in it. The reality is deciding to stay at home has a massive financial impact. It has a massive impact on the dynamic between you and your partner. And that can be really hard. And sometimes that's going to mean not staying true to yourself, not choosing what feels right, choosing something that doesn't feel quite aligned. And that's not easy.
It reminds me of a post I shared last week from the Dr. Naomi episode. And it says, it's okay if you were the woman that wanted a successful career, but then you became a mom and everything shifted. It's not failure, it's transformation. Exactly. And it's like when I saw that post, I was like, I've got to share that one because it is, I myself was one of those people that every time I thought I'm going to have a kid, in my head, I was like, I'm going straight back to work. You know, the minute that was my thing that I was like, oh yeah. And then it became this thing that now I'm struggling with leaving her in a way because I'm like, wow, it's like, this is really not who I thought I was. So, you know, it's one of those things that the idea of becoming a mother, it's not an idea. It's just a picture. And it's a picture that's not a photograph. It's a picture that you've drawn out. And then when the time comes, it's going to be, now you take a picture and compare it, and it's going to be two very different sets of colors. One could be portrait or landscape. One could be a person or whatever. It's going to be so different when you do a comparison. And it's very hard to also accept it.
I think the thing is, you know, I would even say we look at motherhood before motherhood and we build pictures in our minds and it seems quite far away. And, you know, the reality is, I'm sure you remember being pregnant, the reality of parenthood still whilst you're pregnant is just a picture. But then when you're in it and when you're really in matrescence consciously then, and I'd love for us to talk about like when you become conscious of the birth of yourself as a mother and when matrescence begins, because I venture it starts way before you're pregnant, for some consciously, for some not so consciously. But the reality is that you're landing in motherhood and it's not a picture. It's like a 5D smell-o-vision, feel-o-vision. It's like something living in a hologram that we're not actually capable of reproducing for the experience of anything that we could possibly sell. And I think maybe that is a helpful analogy to give an experience beyond that like comprehensive definition that I gave about what matrescence is, that it is all consuming at times. And it's multifaceted just like the development of a child, it is also changing in those periodical ways that the development of a child is changing too. And, dancing with dragons, again, that comes back because sometimes the smell-o-vision experience is amazing, right? That hologram experience is literally like, living in some rosy, cloudy, misty beauty. And sometimes it is the underworld and the shadow emotions that come up. For myself, I'm very open about speaking about when the grief started to come up in my matrescence journey. I was really lucky that hormonally, physically, emotionally, despite the fact my own matrescence meant that I left the father of my child who I'd been in a relationship with for 3 years, despite turbulence, I was just on a complete hormonal high. I was like blissed out until 3 weeks before my son turned 3. Now, part of that shift then was, oh my gosh, I understand what a teenager is, and this feels like hell. I don't know if I'm ready for this complexity. But part of
We are in it right now.
Before my son turned 3, I was surprised by how much judgment and almost hatred I had about the idea of mothers leaving. And then in those first 3 months of Jasper being 3, I remember having an experience where I had to lock myself out on the balcony. And when I realized as the fresh air hit my face, I get it. I understand why people would leave and not look back, because this is so intense. It's bringing up so much from my childhood. It's bringing up so much from my shadow self and the grief that I suddenly felt as I think it coincided also with stopping breastfeeding, because when he turned, I breastfed until my son was like 2.5. Again, if you'd have told me when I was pregnant that I would breastfeed for 2.5, I'd have been like, sorry, did we meet? No, I wouldn't let that happen to my breasts. But the grief was sometimes debilitating. And sometimes it was funny, right? Like the grief also meant that I suddenly needed to have a packet of Marlboro Lights in my cutlery drawer just so that I could see that they were there in case I needed one. Never had one, but I needed it there. I needed a bottle of gin suddenly again in the freezer because I needed to remember that part of my maiden self that was that party girl, that was the wild one. It's very, very intense. And we need to be honest and nuanced about it. It's not that every day I was like grieving and looking longingly at the Marlboro Lights, but it was that some days I would be like, who is this sparkly, funny 3-year-old? And then other days I would be like, I don't know if I'm cut out for this. Yeah.
That's quite profound. And I really hope a lot of people are listening and not feeling guilty for having those emotions, because it's really a part of this whole process that we're going to go through. And every single emotion you've highlighted there, from the blissfulness right down to, extreme measures that you've taken. And, we've heard of a lot of people have taken extreme measures, be it leaving your partner or, some women have even left their own child because they just couldn't get to it. And it's just, these are a wide range of emotions that we really need to be aware of and to also keep our eye on.
Yeah, I think I was very lucky. I was lucky, of course, in that, I was working in a field surrounded by very aware practitioners and therapists and supporters. And also, because of the field that I'm in birth coaching, lots of mothers who had children at different phases of their life. But also because of my development as a coach and a doula, I was still very much in contact with my own coach and also my own therapist. And very early on, I think Jasper was probably about 13 months, I reconnected with my therapist because I'd kind of relocated back to Amsterdam after like 6 months in the UK. And I just wanted to reestablish the contact. And I also really wanted to share my joy and journey because, some of the work that we did in my 20s was also about my fear of motherhood. So it was a very nice full circle moment. But she listened so graciously as I kind of came on Skype then, and like I was waxing lyrical about what an angel guru he was. And she was like, oh, so beautiful to hear this, Ilena. And now tell me about the moments where you want to put him in a bin bag and weigh him down with concrete in the Amstel. Because you must be having those moments filled with rage and hatred too. And, it was like that moment of, did she just say that? And, I honestly, because I was blissed out, I wasn't really having those moments then. But then when he was 3 and those moments came, and I was like, oh, a bit more difficult to wriggle a 3-year-old into a bin bag. But, at least I had that context of, it's not just me. This veracity of emotion, she warned me about. And here it is. I can do this. I can process this and still be a good mum and still love him and still hold space for this part of me that wants to, that moment in the balcony, it was like the week of Amsterdam dance events. I could hear like the thrum of Amsterdam dance event, which was like amplifying the grief as well. So I was like, so I can hold space for myself here on the balcony with the fantasies about the concrete and the bin bag and the Amstel, the fantasies about Amsterdam dance event and, losing 36 hours on a high, and just make peace with the reality of those fantasies playing out and the reality of this extreme frustration in this moment. And I can breathe through it.
I do think a lot of people are quite focused on the first 6 weeks or 6 months because of the intensity of the demands of a child, because their only communication is screaming. And I do remember my own verloskundige was just saying, if it gets too intense, you can just walk out of the house, close the door, the baby will be fine if you leave it in the crib or whatever, and you can just go out because you need to get that breath, And it was basically related to the book where the Kramzorg has to go through all the list. And one of the last things my own said to me was about, shaken baby. And it was a very quick passover, but I realized that was related to the verloskundige going, you have to step outside, step away from the baby. This is for your own sanity. You have, infant baby cries and so much. But you're also talking about 3-year-olds. And it's the fact that these hormone things we're talking about is not just about the baby years where I think I got through the year and it's great. And it's like, oh, no. Like Matrescence is going to be like this hormone thing is going to be going on and on and on.
Yeah. Knock on wood, I'm not perimenopausal, but sometimes I have hormonal floods where I think, oof, am I perimenopausal? And my son is 10. So he is suddenly much more hormonal too. So a simple request to go and empty the recycling bin might prompt in him this arms above the head. I have to do everything around here. And my instantaneous response, if I'm flooded with hormones, is, who the hell are you? You want to talk about who does everything here? Okay. And sometimes that comes out. And then, afterwards I can be like, hey, we both had a really big reaction there. But sometimes I know the best thing for me to do is take the recycling out myself and then come back in and put him on a guilt trip. No, just joking. But that is the reality. Yeah, it doesn't go away. And I was with a really close girlfriend last weekend for brunch with her 2 teenagers, and the complexity of some of the topics that we were navigating, I literally just sat there with my finger over my mouth at a couple of points because I was like, whoa, is this what's awaiting me? How am I going to prepare for that? And then she and I had a walk afterwards, and I was like, I was in awe at how you went about that. Tell me the books. And she said,
in the tent. Let's get in the tent. Let's shake, please. How are we going to do this?
But that is what she said. She said, I don't know of any books, but, I have a friend who's a bit older than me, and I spoke to her about it. And I've always really liked the way she spoke to her teenagers. And I'm just trying to kind of model that, even though the themes that, we were discussing with her daughters are slightly different. But yeah, you're right. Definitely do prepare for postpartum and for the first 6 months. And that's a question I ask myself, is it helpful to say to pregnant people, prepare for postpartum in the first 6 months? Or should we already do our best to open their eyes to the wide spectrum of experience that is coming? I don't necessarily know what's best. I guess it's also very individual, like the unfolding of your journey of matrescence. Some people are going to respond better to being prepared for the wide lens and wide focus on the next 12 to 15 years of their life. And some people need to kind of hone in on what's alive and well right now. Yeah.
I think the best thing is because you're dealing with so much unknown. Like you don't know what the birth is going to be, you don't know what the baby's going to be like. There is just so much that we can't plan. And then if we plan, the frustration is just so big. So I think the best advice is to get your people in line that you can always come to and then work it from there. But make sure that you have one or two people that no matter what time of day, no matter what state you're in, you can always bring them up and like, okay, what the fuck, shit show, let's get going. Like, what am I supposed to do? Because I guess it's like you can, like you say, you plan with this hologram, you plan with this fantasy, you play with, this is how I'm going to be as a mother. And then it's like, we've all had that. And I'm never going to do that. And I'm screaming, blah, 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 blah. And so here we are, reality hits. So I guess this is like really the best thing is to have people to go to for advice and know that they have dealt with different scenarios. So you will probably fall into one of them. So, and then work it from there. I guess this is looking back on my experience in my journey. This is what I can only tell. You can prepare only so much, but you don't know you really don't know. It's totally unpredictable.
And, I think one of the things that I've enjoyed so much about parenthood is really learning in an embodied way that the adage, this too shall pass, is really true. It's, it's true for the positives. It's true for the shit show. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is permanent.
At the same time, like I had this coming from all angles in those, 3 a.m. breastfeeding struggles and crying babies or whatever. And I could punch someone if they were standing in front of me and they were going to quote that to me. And I was like, oh, God damn you. I am punching you right now because do not spit that at me as well. Yeah. But unfortunately, it's a cliche that is goddamn true.
It's true. It is true.
I totally recognize what you're saying. Like in that moment, it's that discerning thing of, okay, when do you say that? And when is it appropriate to say that? I have to say, I notice more and more myself as I prepare to celebrate my son turning 10 and therefore me being in the final probably couple of years of matrescence as I define it, to kind of look back with this backward lens on what was. I am a bit more zoomed out, right? Than, certainly than the two of you with two wonderful three-nagers, right? Like wonderful and very testing three-nagers. I recognize both sides. But, one of the things I say in my signature is that I'm really there to support mothers as a doula, as a coach in like celebrating the muck, the maya, the magic and the miracles of motherhood. And I just think the muck and the maya feels so big when you're in those younger phases. And I think that is maybe hopeful to say, like, as they get a bit bigger, that capacity to zoom out and take that wider perspective becomes easier and easier. So then it feels less loaded that I say, this too shall pass. Even when I say it to myself in that moment where he's like, bruh, like even then, sometimes I'm just grating my teeth and saying, this too shall pass.
When we're rounding up to hear the topic, there's so much to consume. The emotions are already like a massive series on their own. And then we haven't even touched upon the relationships and how this impacts them. And that probably is an episode on its own. I mean, there's so many different ways. So if we can wrap this up, let's just talk about self-care and well-being. And like, let's highlight the importance of self-care during this matrescence, not just those 6 weeks where we always talk about, 2 weeks in bed, by the bed, out of the bed, 60, 40 days, whatever it might be that people have. The ideology that matrescence, as you said, could be 12 to 14 years as well. Can you give us any self-care tips that we can actually take away and kind of hopefully resonate with them?
So definitely don't look up the hashtag self-care on Instagram because all you're going to get is cucumber slices and red nails and toe separators, which also feels amazing sometimes. But, true self-care is really about offering yourself the tender, loving care that we often so readily give to other people in our lives when we see that they're struggling. So it's that little message to check in how someone's doing when they've got a virus. It's that little extra piece of chocolate cake. It's making the time to put the washing out before you go to bed so that when you wake up, maybe you can sneak an extra 5 minutes with your Yorkshire Gold whilst it's still hot before it gets cold. It's interesting because I think sometimes we forget that those things are the things that really make a difference. And sometimes then it's helpful to really write those things down, and maybe just by hearing this, then you do become more aware of the little things that make a difference. Recently I've been really strict with myself this year. It's been a very difficult start to 2024. And there've been days where I've just not even wanted to get out of bed, honestly. So then getting out of bed has felt like an achievement again at some moments. And so to kind of celebrate that achievement, then I'm very strict in making my bed before I leave my bedroom, so that when I come back into my bedroom at the end of the day, regardless of what #2024 energies have unfolded in the day, I come back to my bedroom and I recognize I made the effort to do that because I know how lovely it feels to just peel back the corner of the bed and slip in. And I'm so grateful to that me that made the bed, So sometimes self-care is also that, like writing down those little things or making that choice to pop in at the expat store to pick up your Yorkshire Gold blend tea bags way before they run out. So you're not in that situation where, you don't have any. And I guess what it's speaking to is this idea of proactive, almost like preventative care of self. So rather than treating self-care like an afterthought or like aftercare when we've been firefighting and when we're covered in soot, it's about getting a fireproof suit or making sure that we have a hose pipe on hand. And I think, if I look back at my own journey of matrescence, essentially my self-care started when I began to consciously engage in readying myself emotionally, psychologically, spiritually for motherhood. And that meant working with my therapist, working with my coach. I was really ill in the months before I conceived my child, so I was really taking care of myself nutritionally. And so many of those principles, so many quotes, as we're talking about it now, come back in my mind from books that I read in the period of sickness and in the period of preparation that were like little fertile seeds that then, flourished and bloomed at different times to really galvanize me. And so I would also say sometimes self-care is like going through the rigmarole of self-improvement and making that effort, even if you don't necessarily reap the rewards in the short term.
Taking all the notes.
Yeah, one thing that I found and that's what you said, this whole concept of what are we applying to others. One thing that I really have learned is to be gentle and patient with myself and really being this, do I need to push myself right now? Can I be gentle and can I give myself time? And do I need to do all the things at the same time? Or can I can I be patient with myself and do one thing at a time?
Yeah.
And especially when we talk about changing a habit, it's like we need to go through the 4 pillars of learning, right? Like we can't jump one, and we have to. One very critical part is we have to consciously train and remind ourselves, this is what we're going to do now. And now we're doing it. And now we're doing it. And then how many hundreds of times until it becomes the habit where it just happens without thinking about it. And this is where we need to, and we would never expect this from our children. We would never expect this from them. And we are so gentle and patient with them. And then yet we are so harsh and short-tempered with ourselves. Like, oh, you didn't do this again. And this didn't happen. And why are you like this whole thing? Like, watch yourself talk really. And would you ever speak to someone like this?
Yeah. What's coming to mind now, and I think I shared this with you in one of our first conversations, one of the things that's informed my parenting the most is kind of always or regularly bouncing back to this question: how is he experiencing this moment and this situation? And I wonder if actually there's a little nugget there for ourselves. And, particularly in critical phases of our development and rebirth or unraveling of the essence of who we're becoming as we're embracing motherhood, how does this feel for this vulnerable new expression of me as I let go of some of those ideas I had about who I was going to be or how I was going to experience this moment? How am I experiencing this moment? Can I afford myself that same tenderness and compassion that I offer him when I begin to identify the complexities and the dissonance of the moment for him? Can I afford that same tenderness to myself?
That's reminding me of that social media going around of Matthew McConaughey saying the words, "We're just here to be memories for our kids. Once you're a parent, you're the ghost of your children's future." And so that's a lot to take on, but also then you have to then ... we need to take care of ourselves as well, because we can't lose ourselves in this period of time, giving our all to our children, because this is also our memories as well.
Yeah.
And they move on and grow up with their lives. And by then we'll be in the autumn of our lives, probably.
Yes. And that is also, right, a big part of why we need to talk about matrescence, because we do talk about conception, pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. And we can talk about those things emotionally, psychologically, practically, logistically. We can educate people about what's going to happen physically. But we are doing ourselves a disservice if we don't carve out time to explore these huge evolutionary themes of what is unfolding within us. If we don't speak to people and hear their stories and take little nuggets and pearls of wisdom here and there and take that leap of faith and be vulnerable about and share what's alive for us and hear if there is some feedback, or simply lean into being witnessed, exploring the multifaceted metamorphosis of matrescence is at its essence self-care.
And with that, I'm holding a pen and a paper, and I have my tissues at the ready here, as Ilena has told us to do. Ilena would like to bring us on some form of journey, and she wants both myself and Maren to do this on air as well. But for everyone listening, you guys can maybe listen and pause and write down your own notes. But then if you hear any sniffles, I'll try and mute myself. But for now, Ilena, would you like to bring us through what you had planned?
So I thought what would be really nice to do is some exploratory writing. So I'm going to encourage everybody who's doing this at home to maybe listen to the questions now in congruence with the rest of the podcast, but then come back to this segment of the podcast when there is a good 10 minutes of time. Maybe light some candles, get yourself a nice cup of tea and get a pen and paper and sit down somewhere comfortable and say where you feel like you can relax into the moment and be in your body. The writing prompts are basically sentences, and then you want to just write whatever comes to mind. Doesn't need to be grammatically correct. Nobody's going to read this back. It doesn't need to be well spelt. It doesn't need to be beautifully written, but you're going to have 60 seconds to write. It's just a very boundaried timeline, and then there'll be another writing prompt. The beauty of this, if you're listening to the podcast, is of course that you can press pause. If you find the prompt inspiring, you can write some more, but it's offering this space for your mind to express, to dump, to release in an unhindered, free way. So just write whatever comes to mind. So the first prompt is this: in the 12 to 24 months before I became pregnant, I was preoccupied with. And the next one: if I reflect back to my pregnancy, these are the ideas, the ideals, and the topics that I was preoccupied with. So the next prompt: as I look back now on those 12 to 24 months before pregnancy and that period in pregnancy, I wish I had spent more time exploring. Next one: as I glance back into my matrescence journey thus far, these are the things that spring to mind as the most surprisingly fulfilling aspects of my inner and outer transformation. So I'm going to repeat that, and I'm going to encourage you to not think about motherhood, but really about matrescence, your matrescence. As I glance back into my matrescence thus far, These are the things that spring to mind as the most surprisingly fulfilling aspects of my inner and outer transformation. And the next one, these are the realizations I have made about the way I was parented and how matrescence was modeled to me as I have been journeying through matrescence. So I say it again. These are the realizations I have made about the way I was parented and how matrescence was modeled to me as I have been journeying through matrescence. I guess the subtext there is modeled to me by my mother or my female family members. I just want to acknowledge that these are huge writing prompts. These are difficult writing prompts for just 60 seconds. Some of these writing prompts I would really give 5 minutes to in a coaching context or a workshop context. But it can be surprising what pearls come forward in just a very short space of time. And the last one, as I look forward to the next 12 months of my identity expansion beyond the everyday parenting, I would like to explore these aspects of my identity and of my experience of matrescence. In workshops, I always hate the moment where the host is like, so who would like to share? But essentially, I'm going to be that person. Is there anything that came up that was surprising, maybe?
Yeah, when you said this whole, what were the ideas, ideals, and the topics that you were preparing for in the first 12 months before giving birth? And I wrote down, I was very occupied with the emotional support for others. How can I make this transition for my partner as easy as possible? What can we set in place for him? What can we set in place for these people? How are we going to deal with them? Because in my core, I was like, I'm going to be fine. Like, I'm going to be physically, I was prepared for like physical changes. I was like, all right, how bad is it going to be? Can happen. I looked at all like perineal rippage and all that. I was like, all right, it's just like prepared myself for that. But I just always thought I'll be fine. Like I also did have a therapist. I still have a therapist. So I did say, all right, just keep like an eye on me. But my focus and my work with her was really more about how can we support my husband going through this big life transition for him.
Wow.
And then all on the other side was what are the products? Like what's the best stuff to buy? Like that was really my occupancy with how is it going to be for others and what are the products to buy? These were the things I paid attention to. And that was very funny looking back.
Yeah. And then the follow-up, what you wish you'd been more busy with?
Yeah, well, I wish I've been more busy with how to deal with myself and my expectations. How am I going to tackle this and how am I going to feel and how am I going to deal with frustrations and disappointments and all that I just was not prepared of the vast amount of frustration and disappointments. I thought, how bad can it be, right?
Yeah. And how, if you were advising like a friend who was, at that phase, how would you suggest going about that?
Yeah, really to seek someone that you can talk to. They can really build up a very strong connection with someone who really knows you and you can prompt them to, can you please pay attention to that? Can you pay attention to that? Can you remind me of? And I will not get mad at you when you remind me of that. And I will remember that. And you can remind me that I said that.
Yeah.
That whole thing of just sharing my side of the story and that I have someone who, can listen to that.
Yeah, powerful. Sometimes what comes up as a response to that prompt is also simply the realization, like, okay, when you say 12 to 24 months before I got pregnant, then there is also the realization like, whoa, I actually was making space for pregnancy in my life 2 years before I got pregnant. And that's often a game changer to realize that actually subliminally, subconsciously, there is an awareness growing and a space being made.
And I wish one thing also that I would have paid a little more attention to my partner. Like how are they floating around? What's going on there? And how are we going to address difficult topics? And what's the reaction to that? Like really just more like, how are we going to be as a team parenting, going in with the idea that I want to be parent with this partner and I want to have a family with them.
Yes.
And how are we going to deal with that? And what are the answers to some of the questions that we will have?
Yeah, huge piece. Eva, what about you, my love?
For me, the question too, if I reflect back to the pregnancy, the ideas and ideals and topics. So myself and Mara were both pregnant in COVID. Yeah. So for me, it was a case of like, I was very lucky. Well, I mean, I couldn't work anymore because contracts were revoked, but that was when I got into my healthiest because I was out exercising every day. I think we actually watched one TV series, like one in the entire of COVID.
Whoa.
Because we just read books, we played games, we didn't have the TV on, we had no internet. Like, I mean, we connected with our family more, but we were on the balcony, we were enjoying, during the spring or summer months. So I was actually in a really good place. And I think that was what made pregnancy so wonderful for me. But then your next question, as Maren said, was, as I look back now in the 12 to 24 months, what do I wish I'd spent more time exploring? I mean, mine is basically myself. If I'd looked at therapy, if I'd addressed traumas, if I was more looked into the somatic element of things as well, being in touch with my body and understanding what it was going to go through, what it was going through, what it is going through, and taking that taking that very seriously. And also, it was also a case of what is a village? Like actually starting to understand what is a village? What is going to be my community? Who is in it? Like, what is this? Because when you're pregnant, you're kind of like, I'll do the groundwork. And like Maren says, we all did our research. What are the products? What's the best ones? What's EU regulation or whatever. But we kind of forget the fact that how are we going to connect with these other women? We don't know them. Our only bond is going to be the fact that we're pregnant. And then, but then our episode that we had with Naomi back at the start of the podcast was basically, we were talking about the village and she was addressing all different elements of a village that I was only finding out in that episode as she spoke. And I was like, oh, they're a part of my village?
Yes.
And it was an awakening of what is a village? And a village is not just these women who are going to come around and do your nesting party and clean your house and bring food for you and, share all their baby clothes. It's actually a lot more. And it's players that aren't a big significant part, but they are a part.
Yeah.
And I really wish I had understood that back then.
Yeah. It's really interesting, again, from through an idealistic gaze, like I do sometimes wonder, like, how do we reach women before they're pregnant? Idealistically, I had the joy a couple of years ago of speaking to my son's class about what I do for a living and talking to them about like their birth stories. It was amazing to me that in a group of like 26 kids, like 6 kids wanted to share their entire birth story. Amazing. But, many of those were girls. And should we speak to women at the peak of their maidenhood in teenage years about matrescence and what is to come? I can't help but think that it would also honor maidenhood.
Well, humanity is going to die because everyone in their right mind is going to say, well, that I'm
not having a kid. Yeah. No, thank you.
What's going to happen? It's either going to be, I'm not having a baby, or what are you talking about? No.
Idealistically, I'm sure there would be less children and that would probably be a really healthy thing. But I do also think that then the children that would be there and the mothers and the parents that would be raising those children would be so much healthier.
Yes.
That it wouldn't be like a cataclysmic, chaotic approach to it. It would be a more compassionate, balanced, wider lensed angle perspective. And that would be healthier.
That was exactly the word that popped into my head when you were talking about. I was like, probably would be healthier because we would pay more attention to our mental health. We would seek help earlier. We would address things earlier. We would not sit on them and like grieve through and like think something's wrong with us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So less babies and healthier
it's also kind of making it also in my head, the fact that if we give this education at a younger age, those people will be compassionate to their friends who are pregnant, because that's one of the things is when I became pregnant and I had a child, I felt I needed to apologize to some people, to be like, I did not understand. I'm so sorry. Like I still need to apologize. I think I've even apologized to my sister-in-law. Like I didn't understand, and I still probably need to apologize to a lot of more people, because we don't know until you go through it. And the thing is, giving these women, maybe they might have just a little bit more compassion to their friends who might be having births early, and to actually understand, like, you know what, bringing food over and not having to talk, but just literally turning up with some food is actually more of a thing that you can do than just sit and listen maybe as well. I mean, just knowing those small things to me is like, wow, imagine having that knowledge in your 20s.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, tell me about what you're looking forward to exploring in the next 12 months of your matrescence.
We're ending this up now because this is one of our longest episodes.
Okay, sorry.
Well, I mean, look, personally for me, like mine was actually learning my values, because in relation to Naomi's episode last week, when we were talking about self-identity, she shared with us a way to actually figure out your values. So it was also kind of like looking at that. It was also the relationship with my partner, trying to figure out ways to finally go on a date, to just small little movements there. Also finding alone time, because I don't have alone time, because I'm doing a multitude of different things. If it's not the podcast, or if it's Gift Guild, or if it's my father's 80th birthday, or if it's a family holiday, or if it's moving house, or if it's taking care of a cat who keeps, coughing up fur balls everywhere. I mean, I don't get time alone. I don't get me time. And so that's something I'm really like looking for. Maybe even a hobby, but let's not push it. And I think lastly, my list was actually looking at my village and my community. Yeah. And this is something myself and Maren actually spoke about even last night. It was a case of, we don't have time to take more people on, but it's now to kind of look at who's there and to make sure we are fulfilling every aspect that we are actually needing, and becoming aware of who's in it.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, mine, I just wrote down connection with a big exclamation mark. And I mean, this connection with myself, really tuning in what Eva also said, like, how am I feeling? What do I need? But also connection with my child when we're going through difficult patches that will come with going to school, all these big transitions. How can we stay connected, and how can we really, make this easier for everyone, this big transition? But also, like Eva said, connecting with my partner, because I have realized since becoming parents, you get a little disconnect, and I've put up guards that I have noticed. And now we're both, I feel like, finally landing a little more in this whole thing. And like, really, okay, this is it. Now we found our groove. We've made like the first 3 years. Like, okay, now we can like start dancing a little again. But I'm still a little hesitant when this lightness comes back in. I'm like, oh, when is this real? Like, can I like trust this now? And I want to trust this again, and I want to experience this lightness, and I want to experience this connection. So this is really what I want to focus on for the next
beautiful
year.
And you do have to think, like, I'm going to be as quick as I can, but you do have to imagine a little bit when you are navigating your own relationship to your partner, what it is for them, because you fell in love at the peak of maidenhood, probably the peak of your expression of maidenhood and your fertility and that nubile mid-20s, or whatever age you were. And then you begin to unravel, you begin to let go of conditioning, you begin this rebirth, or this rediscovery, or this deepening of the connection to self. Your connection is bound to change. They also then, by proxy, need to rediscover who you are, and you, by proxy, rediscover who they are in their matrescence, if it's a male partner, or their matrescence too, if it's a female partner. So definitely a whole episode on relationships and matrescence, but beautiful that you share those goals and hopes for what's to come.
We'll have to check in a year's time then.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
And no need for tissues for this episode with Ilena. Everyone would be glad to know.
I left out some of the more tearful prompts.
Oh, thank you. If you're still here, I want to say thank you for sticking around. It's definitely one of the longest episodes we ever had on the Damn Parenting podcast. So if you are still here with me, I'm very impressed, and I'm also very grateful. But honestly, this conversation is such an important one for mothers to hear, because when we're going through these internal shifts, the identity changes, the emotional changes, the sense that something inside us is transforming, all while we're actually living abroad, it can feel really confusing and lonely, or like we're the only ones experiencing it. And the truth is, we're not. And understanding what's actually happening during this period of change can make such a difference. And it gives us language and it gives us perspective. And sometimes it simply just gives us a relief of knowing we're not doing motherhood wrong and we're just moving through this transformation. So if this episode resonated with you, please do share it with another mother who might need to hear it too. Send it to a friend, a sister, a WhatsApp group, or someone who might be wondering what the hell's happening to them right now. You can also follow us on Instagram at the Damn Parenting Podcast, where we continue these conversations, keep bringing the real stories of motherhood into the open. If you want to be on the podcast, do reach out if you want to share your story, birth stories or experiences, or if you just want to have a damn chat. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And if you're enjoying this show, sharing it really does help more parents find these conversations. So thank you for listening, and I'll hear you in the next episode.